If language is a form of soft power, what does that say about English, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, but in particular Russian? And if Russian is on the decline, what can we lose by not studying it or not speaking it? Today, it's associated with war and invasion. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
More than anything else, Russian was the glue that bound the Soviet Union together. As the bloc's official and dominant language, it was spoken by the administration, politicians, and the military. The domination of Russian allowed the vast multi-ethnic empire to function coherently. Mastering Russian opened the doors to career advancement, access to knowledge and education, and paved the way for participation in Soviet political life. It also facilitated inter-republic migration and the spread of a shared Soviet identity. Moreover, Russian was the primary language of higher education and science, and the lingua franca uniting over 100 ethnic groups across 15 republics. Russian language scientific and technical education created an elite class of fluent speakers, often centered around Moscow and Leningrad. Although each Soviet republic had its own titular language, for instance Ukrainian in Ukraine, Uzbek in Uzbekistan, and so on, and while the USSR officially encouraged the friendship of peoples and the equality of languages, Russification was not so much an organic occurrence as a major policy from the 1930s onward. But Russian as a tool of social engineering extended beyond the USSR's borders. Russian was compulsory in schools across Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Vaunted as the language of socialism and international brotherhood, Russian was perceived by these countries' nationals as an imposed foreign language rather than a cultural aspiration. Russian gained traction in parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America as a conduit to higher education and better living. Students from Morocco, Egypt, Vietnam, and other countries were flown to Moscow to take part in scholarship programs. Taking Cuba as an example, tens of thousands of Cubans studied in Soviet universities and technical institutes from the 1960s through the 1980s. Citizens of the Global South either stayed, forming relationships with Russian peers, or returned to their homelands as engineers, doctors, economists, teachers, and military officers. But they came home armed with more than just knowledge. They often absorbed an all too positive and reductive perception of the Soviet Union and Russia.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Michał Broniatowski, the editor-in-chief here at TVP World. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
We've finally got you on, which is a good thing. We'll be talking about the connection between language, action and power, and we're focusing in particular on Russian. And our clip there introduced it as a Soviet phenomenon, but the use of Russian and the Russification goes beyond that, doesn't it?
Of course, there's the Soviet Union, the Republic of Soviets, dominated by Russians, was inherited from the Tsarist times, from the Imperium, which was started to be built in 18th century and made its biggest achievements in 19th century, taking over Central Asian territories, because they were not states at that time, and also Caucasus nations living there, and even the hymn of the Soviet Union. The first line was the union of unbeatable Soviet republics, was for ages united by Big Russia. We know that it is not the case anymore, but of course one of the tools of this colonization was Russian language. The same as in the case of Roman Empire, where the Latin language was this tool. And the same with the case of British Empire, which was using English language until today. Elites of India speak English. In this meaning, it didn't very much differentiate the history of this colonization using the language doesn't differ from any other colonial, because it is very important to remember that Russian Empire is as much a colonial empire as was Britain and Rome and well, many others in history.
Was there any room for the local languages to flourish under the Tsarist regime?
You know, the Russian incursion into Siberia and Central Asia, and but not so much in Caucasus, was in fact connected with bringing civilization as we see it here in Europe, bringing education, more rights for poor people, and it was also written language, as opposed to many languages, especially in Siberia. So it became the language of elites and language of education, language of culture. And, you know, I had a friend in Moscow who is a Georgian Jew who has Armenian name and landed with his family in Uzbekistan. And he told me that when he was a student, this conglomerate, which was at the Tashkent University, of many languages, all of them were speaking Russian, and they were proud of speaking Russian, considering their old languages. They were young and stupid. They consider their native languages. In his case, you cannot tell which is the native language. They considered Russian as lingua franca, and they were proud.
It's a useful language.
Yeah, and they were proud of using it. That they could connect. There was a culture, pop culture, TV, films, theaters. All that was in Russian.
Was there a difference in policy between the Russification of Central Asia, if we can call it Russification, and the Russian policy, linguistic policy in the West, in the lands that it conquered from the Polish Commonwealth?
Funny enough, for 100 years, almost 100 years, in the territories of Polish territories occupied by Russia, while the others were occupied by Austria and Germany, on Russian-occupied territories, Polish language was allowed as a language in schools, used by administration, and only after an uprising in 1863. Poles call it the January uprising, which was against Russians, against Russian occupation. It failed, was defeated, and after that, all administrative documents were written in Russian. You know, the birth certificates were in Russian, and so on. So this Russification was much stronger after that. Simultaneously in German, on German more to the west, territories occupied by Germany, there was this Germanization, as they call it.
A final question to you on this half of our discussion. Was there a civilizing mission that the Russian Empire had to civilize its conquest, rather like the French, the British? Did they feel a 19th century sort of ethos of bringing this culture and civilization to the tribes in the East through language?
You know, it's I hate this civilizing word because it usually meant in 19th century, if not in 20th also, meant destruction of local cultures. As I said, the main issue was that Russian was a written language and language of religion which came with this. Orthodox Christianity. So it was not definitely helping the survival of local cultures. It was, pushing them down to local communities and so on. But the language of masters.
Yes,
was Russian. And funny enough, in St. Petersburg, where there was the seat of the empire, the French was the language.
Yes, that's right.
To speak.
A final question is, just to carry on this theme about the written Cyrillic language, would it have been possible for a local Central Asian elite to vocalize, to express their own culture in Cyrillic rather than their own language?
Some of them, as we know, are spoken, local spoken languages are written in Cyrillic. Like, for example, in Kazakhstan, it's not the same Cyrillic as the Russian one, but it's Cyrillic, the same as with Ukraine, the same with Belarus.
We'll go on to our second feuilleton to describe the contraction, if we may, of the Russian language.
Today, Russian is the most widely spoken language in Europe, according to the Center for Eastern Studies think tank. Taking this piece of information and connecting it to the old Russian adage saying that Russia is wherever one hears Russian, one is left with some brow-raising geopolitical implications. Aside from Russia and the territories it illegally occupies, Russian continues to be an administrative language in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. According to the Center for Eastern Studies, nationals of Central Asian states are more proficient in Russian than the citizens of South Caucasus countries such as Georgia and Azerbaijan, except for Armenia, where the language is spoken across most social strata. But while in the past, Soviet Republic students dreamed of pursuing higher education in Moscow, today Kazakhstan's Bolashak International Student Exchange Program is prioritizing other destinations, including US, European, and Turkish universities. In Article 10 of Ukraine's 1996 constitution, Ukrainian was listed as the official language of the country. However, the same article also guaranteed, quote, the free development, use, and protection of Russian, which dominated in media, entertainment, and publishing, mainly owing to years of suppression of the Ukrainian language under the Soviet Union. Only the full-scale Russian invasion on February 24, 2022, brought about a broad divorce from Russian, with many people switching to Ukrainian. Interestingly, the global significance of the Russian language has been growing elsewhere, notably in the Islamic radicalization in post-Soviet republics. This is because Russian is a readily available means of communication, as opposed to Arabic, which would have to be taught for the sake of indoctrination. In former Warsaw Pact countries, Russian has been in decline since the USSR's demise. In Poland, Russian is no longer a mandatory school subject. According to data from Poland's Ministry of Education, only a little over 2,000 schools offer Russian as an elective subject. The current highly antagonistic relations between Europe and Russia contribute to this situation.
We'll take our cue from Poland and the alleged decline of the teaching of Russian in Polish schools. We seem to have we've rejected the Soviet Imperial idea, but what have we lost by not studying Russian as a language?
What is lost?
Yes.
Well, the same with...
Is that a big mistake that Poland made?
I think it's the same case as any other language, European language. There's really no point for impose obligatory Russian language in schools, as opposed to English, who is obviously the lingua franca of the world now. And there are no indications that it would change very soon. So I'm not regretting that I learned Russian when I was young, but I was also privately learning English. Big surprise for me when I was working in Moscow. My son and his girlfriend, they came to visit me, and there was a difference of 2 years between them. He was 2 years older, and he could read names of streets and other inscriptions on the street in Cyrillic, while his girlfriend was completely lost, like in China. For me, it was a shock that somebody doesn't understand Cyrillic.
Have we lost the notion of communicating in Russian with, say, on a diplomatic level or business level?
It's always good to speak local language when you are a diplomat, but of course you can speak with them in English, you can speak with them in French. By the way, Russian diplomats are very, very well educated. They would speak obligatory French and English and local languages with almost no accent. So. But as I said, I don't regret the fact that people are not learning Russian anymore. I must say that after the invasion, the full-scale invasion in 2022, I really feel a little shivering when I hear Russian. So because this is now the language of murderers, right? But I also know quite well Ukraine, where getting rid of Russian and replacing it with Ukrainian was an act of patriotism, an act of independence. When I first came to Ukraine, it was a bit more than 20 years ago. There were, and it was already 13 years after becoming independent country. The TV stations were all Russian language. There were very small little channels who spoke Ukrainian, but the main channels, all of them were in Russian, and there was not a single nationwide newspaper which would be in Ukrainian. Actually, I came there to create such a newspaper, which failed because the distributors were all Russian-speaking oligarchs, and they didn't want it. So the project failed, and after 2014, after the initial invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine by Russia, there was a law passed by the Ukrainian parliament which made only Ukrainian the state language, and the Russian became one of minority languages in the country. It was also banned from administration. It was a shock for Moscow. It was also a difficult situation for many Ukrainians who only spoke Russian. They had contact with Ukrainian, especially in places like Kharkov in the east, Sumy, and also in Kiev, which was mostly Russian-speaking city. But today, you will not hear Russian anywhere on the territory of Ukraine. And this is, one of the biggest mistakes of Mr. Putin was starting this. Apart of anything else,
yes.
Of Mr. Putin was starting this aggression because he really finished Russian as a means of communication in Ukraine.
The clip there showed us that it seems to be advancing in the kind of jihadist circles as a useful language to have. How do you see that?
It's explained in this piece.
Yeah.
It's simpler for them to use Russian, especially that Quran is available in Russian as well. So they don't need to learn additional language. But jihadism is not the ruling stream of development of these places. It's a rebirth of their local cultures. It applies not only to new countries, the former Soviet republics like Georgia, Armenia, or Azerbaijan, where they have their own languages, and in younger generation you may have difficulty in finding people speaking Russian, like in Poland.
Yes.
But it also refers to Caucasian republics which are still inside the Russian Federation.
What you mentioned the shock that the rejection of Russian as a language had in the Kremlin circles. In what sense a shock? That their culture was being rejected, their history, what they had to offer, the world was being rejected?
As we said at the beginning, the Russian language was a language of colonization. With Ukraine, it's a bit different situation, because actually the first strong state, Orthodox state, Christian state of Eastern Slavians was Ukraine, not Russia. Moscow was created only after the fantastic cathedral of St. Catherine in Kiev was built.
Yes.
So it's very important to remember that, and Russians are constantly trying to falsify history, saying that Ukrainians are a lower
relations, yes,
a lower kind of people compared to their high culture. That's true that Russian language was used to create big literature in 19th century. However, there was local Ukrainian literature written in Ukrainian, but of course there are these huge names of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky and Pushkin. But this is probably because as we say here, the language of elites in 19th century was Russian.
The Russian foreign policy seems to be making inroads in the Sahel district, the Sahel area of North Africa. Seems to be replacing French influence as a political tool. Is it replacing it linguistically as well? How do you see the...
They have... of course, they are trying to introduce Russian, but I think the Chinese are much more successful because in every place, in every country, in Africa, South America, in Asia, there are, even in Poland, there are these institutes of Chinese language teaching people Chinese. This is not the problem in Poland. It's advantage that you can learn Chinese, but in many countries which are I would say remotely colonized by China, I mean they lend them money and make them dependent on them and invest in these countries heavily, and at the same time they teach them Chinese. I think that this Chinese soft power is now much more powerful than Russian soft power, because Russians being involved so heavily in Ukraine are unable to implement their hard power.
Yes. As a final roundup of how would you evaluate the state of the Russian language? Does it automatically follow if its power, soft power declines, hard power declines, does its soft power decline with it? How do you see
the
state of the language
do a lot
literature
to destroy their soft power, because like in the case of Ukraine, they impose their hard power in order to keep their soft power. So they are not winning the hard one, and they are losing heavily on the soft side. And the same as in former Soviet Republic, and also there is, well, it's difficult to say that in Belarus we will soon see the rebirth of Belarusian language, but you know, Lukashenko will not live forever, and there are centers of promotion of Belarusian, like, for example, our TVP station, yes. Bilsat, which speaks only Belarusian.
Michał Broniatowski, we have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you very much for coming on to our programme.
Thank you.
That's it. Do join us next time. How we got here, that's Tuesdays, 35 minutes past 9, 21:35. Join us then.